Hello everyone. My name is Lele, and I, I I was one of the people that started 8-Ball Community. 8-Ball Community is a collective and a community space that runs programmings with mostly education directions, but it's run by volunteers, and we work and we kind of create a bridge between art and media, and we try to find as much space as we can for independent media and give people platforms to show their work and tell their stories. We work, there's about 50 volunteers with us, and we're divided into 5 teams mostly, and there's the radio. So we are now in our space, in our new headquarters. So this is where the radio happens. This is a radio. This is the library. So the volunteers kind of like choose what teams to work for, and then they usually work all the way to the back here. This is our green screen where we do our public access TV, and half away where you see this table here, it's where we do our publishing. And then we have a merch team that kind of produces like t-shirts and merchandise for us, which is kind of our way of supporting the space. 8-Ball existed since 2012, started in Brooklyn, and we kind of moved around quite a bit. And we focused a lot of our energies, especially at the beginning, with publications and zines. We ran a zine fair in New York. We've done 14 so far. The next one's supposed to be in June, but probably won't happen. And we also publish a lot of zines, as I was saying, with the publishing team. And zines in general, zines is something that I personally have been connected to since the 90s. I'm from Rome, and I grew up in Italy, and I started getting into zines when I got into graffiti, but then it developed into more something to do with first music and culture in general. And then once I discovered photography at the age of 20, 21, I started using it as a way of showing my work. And zines, it's something that basically represents self-publishing. So zines, as we see it now, it's something that exists since the invention of Xerox, but the concept of self-publishing has existed for much longer, ever since printing facilities became a little bit more accessible for people. People have used it to publish their own work. Often was writing stuff, so a lot of poetries were first distributed through zines or like publishing format, and also science fiction novels really were amongst the first that were really using the self-publishing as like a platform or a way of showing their own work. And what else? In terms of the way that zines, as we call them now, that comes from the word magazines, dropping the mega. We know them as zines since as I was saying, the 70s, since the Xerox, and more specifically, the queer community started using zines as like a way of like showing, disseminating informations amongst each other. And it was then picked up by the punk music scene. And so a lot of young people that wanted to write about music would go to shows, and they would put together their own zines and sell it as shows at very cheap price. I brought here just one example of an old music fanzine. That's how they were called originally. This is from Los Angeles, and it's from the early 80s. And as you can see, it's all collaged together and often like handwritten, and they were mostly interviews with bands that at that time were new bands, and now we know them as being much larger. But that's how a lot of like the punk band started being known first. I also, so we started collecting zines at Able since roughly 2013, when we opened a newsstand. We took over a newsstand that was in disuse in the subway in Brooklyn, and we were running it as a zine shop. And so from that, we started collecting and started keeping track of zines that people were putting together. And any questions at this stage? You're all unmuted, so you'll have to, you're all muted, so you'll have to unmute yourself if you want to talk.
No questions. This is, I've never, like, I learned zine history as part of my, like, comics history and all that, but I've never actually seen one of these originals from the 80s. It's gorgeous.
We have more, and I can show you more of the old stuff. I just felt like, to me, zine is something that is still really going a lot, and the scene is still very vibrant, because it's just, so one thing that I missed in the history of zine is that, so somewhere towards the mid 90s, artists started using the tool, the medium of a zine to show their work. And by artists, I mean any sorts of, from visual artists to writers. It was just like the cheapest, the simplest and cheapest way of showing your work. And so since then, zine became more of like an alternative to another artwork and piece of work. And so a lot of painters also use zines as a way of showing their work, and a lot of illustrators and photographers. And so a lot of the things that we decided to keep for our library, it's mostly zines that are produced as we exist right now. Because one thing that needs to be said is that majority of zines gets produced in a very small amount. And very often they distribute it by hand by the person that produces them. This is what makes them unique compared to a book, for instance, where there's a publisher, an editor, a distributor, stores, and there's all of these in-betweens, middlemen. Zines are literally, you put together the zine, you print the zine, you distribute the zine. Sometimes you can go to some zine stores to sell them. Often people sell them at zine fairs, but very, very often people distribute it by giving it around to other zine makers. So because there was so little production of zines, we felt like it was important to try and collect all of those few copies that were getting produced for future generations. So we tried to keep a lot of our collections somewhat contemporary. We get invited to do a lot of work in other countries and other cities, and this is often a great opportunity for us to learn of the scene in that specific city. And so that's why a lot of the stuff that we also have here come from all over the world. They don't just come from the United States or New York specifically. So now I was gonna show you some kind of zines that people have produced over the last few years, and some type and styles of binding and zine making in general. So I'm gonna start from, if there aren't any questions, you can just shut me out and just talk, or I'm just gonna keep going otherwise. So I'm gonna start with this zine. This is a zine published in 2019. It's a doodle zine, a drawing zine of mushrooms by Jason Samuel Wright. And there's a publisher in this zine, that's Udley Edition. And if you can see, they try to reproduce a binding that's a little bit more advanced than a regular zine. They just use like a glue on the side. So they try to reproduce what usually books are made of. And so the zine, it's all drawings of somewhat mushrooms having life of their own. So this is the first zine. Then I want to show you this zine called Froggy by Eddie Modica, and it's called Duty Hole it's her Instagram. This binding, as you can see, it's much simpler than the one that we just saw, and it's really cardboard. What makes this zine very unique is also the fact that each individual copies that Eddie has produced, it's individually glued on. So each one of the parts are like glued on and written by. So however many, I don't know what the edition, often people tend to put an edition on the zine. I don't know what the edition of the zine was, but however many Eddie was making, they're all very much unique pieces. So it becomes almost like a piece of art of its own with the simplicity of something like this. And it becomes a pocket-sized zine. So this is a second kind of zine. Now, this zine that I'm going to show you is made by an Italian artist called Camilla Candida Donzella. And in Italy, there's these other kind of staples. They look like regular staples, but they come out this way, and they usually get hanged on the wall here. This zine is a collection of drawings of wanted men that she found on the internet. So wanted men with hoodies specifically, at least she tried to like focus a lot on the hoodies. And I think that her discourse was all around the fact that it's almost absurd that something drawn like this could identify a human being. And so she decided to put it together almost like an art piece. So, dangerous portraits. This is another type of zine, which is often there's many type of zines that are put together with content that's found on the internet or through magazines or all around. There's another zine that I'm going to show by Clark Allen. I wanted to show these also because of the binding. So this type of binding is called Japanese binding. It's a much simpler way of doing it than, for instance, the glue binding that I showed you at the beginning. But it's still a little bit more complex than a regular one. But the way that Clark put it together, it was pretty simple because they used a hole puncher and it just followed the hole puncher. Usually this kind of binding is a little bit more complex and tends to go over this side. And the paper, the way the Japanese people usually do it, they fold the paper this way and they usually bind it together like this. It's just an old method for Japanese to bind. This zine is also mostly illustrations and drawings with some collages and photographs to go with it. Okay, so Bobby Horse by Clark Allen. Now, let's move on to other kind of publications. Again, I reiterate, but no stress. If you have any sort of questions on anything that I'm saying or any of the zines that I'm showing you, don't hesitate. So these, yes,
How
yes.
are you collecting these? Oh, I'm sorry. Good.
No, go ahead.
So how are you collecting these? Do artists submit them to you, or do you source out artists that you know are currently making zines?
So that's a good question. So we haven't been able to send out a call, like send us zine. It's something that we want to do and we've been wanting to do, but we haven't had, until only now, we haven't had a space to show zines as much. We have almost 14,000 zines at this point, but for all of this time, we kept them in boxes, and we've been doing slowly this sort of like very basic archiving, which is filling out a form that tells you roughly what's in a zine, but we haven't been able to pull them out. So we didn't want to overdo it, let's say. So for now, we've been getting them directly from the artists, mostly at zine fairs, at book fairs, and zine fairs, book fairs, and some stores. We also are in touch with some artists directly. So for instance, this zine was given to us by the artists themselves, who are part of our community. And we tend to like often invest the money that we make at a zine fair to buy more zines for the library. Yeah, so that's kind of how we usually get them. We are given sometimes zines by artists just to be in the library, but we haven't really been able to like send out a call to get them shipped. Now, Panda, I'm gonna call you Panda because I don't know your first name, was asking what's the oldest zine we have. I know that we have some zines from the late 60s that were made by high schoolers in the Lower East Side. Kelly is your name. Okay, sorry. We have the oldest zines we have, that now I would have to find it amongst all of them, is these two pages zines that these teenagers were doing in the 80s, in the 60s in the Lower East Side. And it was all about kind of how to go to music shows and how to get around by being a minor in the city. And right after that, so early 70s, we have these other zines that are from the East Village specifically, which is where we are right now, which it's almost the opposite, but it's again a 2-page zine. It was all done with a typewriter, and it was all for junkies on how to get around with buying drugs and dealing with being a junkie. And which is a very bizarre opposite thing to the other one that I was saying. And then from the mid 70s, we have a bunch of, from the mid 70s to early 90s, we have a lot of music fanzines like the one that I showed you, both from here and from the UK. We have a lot of stuff from the UK because a few years ago, in 2014, I think, we did a show of fanzines by this band called Crass from the UK. It was a punk band that worked as a community also. And they had a commune. They actually still have a commune outside of London. And they were making a lot of zines that they were also in many zines as a review. They were reviewed in many zines in the 70s, and they decided to sell them all. So before they all got sold to a library, we managed to exhibit and keep some of them. So we have some of those too. Anyway, there's no questions. Keep going. We're showing you zines. So one of our community volunteers, Bobby, they are part of various other collectives, and mostly queer collectives. And they put out these one-sheet zines that are for usually resources and help to do with this one is a self-defense, this is dealing and healing, a mental health guide, and then your body, your choice, and keep it that way. So these kind of zines, these are one-sheet zines. It's something that we tend to do a lot and people tend to do a lot because it's easy, it's cheap to reproduce, and it's also fun to put together. I'll show you how they work. So you see them, they have individual pages, and then they open up, and they usually have a poster or a back page. So make these kind of zines. It's simple. Yeah, this is the simplest, and it's a great way of just like, especially for informations, it's kind of a great way of producing information and send it out. And so this is, I'm glad you all know, but these kind of zines are like really useful. So we produced a lot of that. So the fact that it's so cheap and so easy to make, we were able to make like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and give them away. So there was no issues with like production in that sense. So the group that they were mostly doing it was Sad Girls Club. I don't know if you know. It's a collective that's based in New York. Now, this is a flip book, which I thought was a cute way of showing. This was also by somebody from our community called Ava Merkel. And as you can see, yeah, it's a flip book, exactly. And it's very simple. It's hand wrote each individual pages, and that's it. Very simple binding, very cheap and effective. So this is our flip book zine. Now I want to show you some other. This is another fun zine that I really enjoy. This is number 6 of 7 issues that were made in total, and it's called Slice Harvester. And it's the person that makes it, now I forget his name, but he's a writer, and he really enjoys pizza. And so he went to every pizza slice places in New York by neighbors and made reviews of every one of the pizza places. And if you see the little pizzas are, he's voting for each one of the slices, and he describes everything from the crust to the cheese to the space itself, how people treat it in there, how long the pizza will stay warm, and yeah, the freshness and all, and the toppings and so on. And I thought this was like a very brilliant small series of zines that he was doing. And so he managed to make the whole of New York in 7 zines, and I believe that it says at the beginning of each one where it goes from. Let's see. It usually says where it goes to. Oh, this is the villages. So East and West Village. I don't know where you can find these. He's been around a lot and he's been producing them a lot. So I believe that Print and Matter must have still copies of it. So does Quimby's. So Quimby's is a zine shop in New York. It was actually originally from Chicago and moved to New York about 4 years ago. Otherwise, Print and Matter should have it, which is the biggest zine stores and independent bookstore in Chelsea. maybe you can try Blue Stocking. Blue Stocking is on Allen Street, and it's also a very old zine shop, and it's run like a co-op similar to this space. Is run by volunteers. They have a coffee shop, and it's mostly focused on feminist zines and feminist collectives. It's a very great place to learn about if you don't know about it yet. And this I thought was interesting to see. Like I brought a couple of copies of these, a couple of different types, but these are, because like a lot of the zines that I showed you so far were mostly handmade and hand collage and hand laid out, but this one is made entirely on computer. So the images are images found on the internet, and then it's laid out all entirely on the computer. And the idea is that, I guess, it's just like the craziness there are. Yeah, it looks like a yearbook. Very true. The way that yearbooks are edited now and laid out now, really. And I brought another one, also another digital one from the internet that I thought was fun to look at. I mean, this is really colorful and ravey. This is the other thing. Zines tend to be black and white because kind of everyone has a black and white photocopier. But right now, it's also easy to find somewhat cheap places to do color copies, especially if you have like a digital file that you want to send out and get it back ready. Now, online, there are so many different ways of doing it. One place that we use a lot is called Best Value Copies. That's in Jersey, I believe. And you can call them and talk about different kind of paper that you want them, or you can get them to be binded or not binded, and then you bind it yourself. But that tend to be, that's one we use a lot whenever we want to do like larger amount and in color. Because owning a color copier is still expensive. That's just kind of a general thing. Now, this zine that I'm showing you, it's also kind of found. It's made by these, it's made from a collections of images that come from these magazine called Teen Angels. Teen Angels wasn't, I think still exists, if it's not been closed for only a few years, but it was mostly like based on Latinx culture and in California and the West Coast. And so this is all secret signage, as you can see, signals, sorry. And it's how, especially in the 80s, where there were all these like different languages made by with their hands, often connected to gangs. Teen Angels, it's a magazine that had a lot of stuff for people that were incarcerated in the Latinx community, from their lovers or to their lovers, and there were a lot of like love stories throughout it. So these I thought was like an interesting thing to look at. Now I'll move on to, so this zine is by an artist called Barry McGee, who's like a somewhat known artist from the 90s. And he's also based in the West Coast, in California, in San Francisco. And this is a zine that was made as a catalog for one of his shows. And he shows in like really big galleries in Chelsea and shows in museums around the world. It's a really big name, but I wanted to show you how even big names tend to make zines nowadays. So it mixes photographs to drawings of his work to images of installations of his pieces. These are more like his painting style, and this is more like graffitis that he either finds around or makes himself. So this is Barry McGee zine. which I thought was like kind of an interesting take on zine. It's very image based. He's also a surfer. He goes on scooters, as you can see. Okay, so this is a more, let's say, mainstream zine maker. Other zines that I put together, I'll show you one photo zines, and then I was going to show you some of the work that I put together. So this is by another photographer that also shows in art in galleries and so on. His name is Peter Sutherland, and these are some of his photographs. This is a zine from, I believe, 2014. And this is what a photo zine often looks like. Let's see what year it is. 2012. Okay, so this is some of the zines that I showed you. And I'm going to show you now a zine that we produce, like a regular zine that we produce with 8-Ball. We make a lot of zines, some of them a little bit more evolved, some of them a little simpler, let's say. So this zine is called Affinity Journal. We also work a lot with activism, and we try to spread as much knowledge as we can. So every month and a half, we do this called Affinity Journal. We work on this together. We laid it out in a collage style, and I brought you some copies of the original pages for the new one that we're making. And we often have a theme. This was the very first one we did, which didn't have a theme, but every one of us just worked on one page or 2 pages, and then we compile it together. We have a big party, and we all like work together on putting them, assembling them, and then printing them all. And then we don't really want to have an editions on something like this. We want people to have them. So we tend to make usually 50, and then when they run out, we make another 50, and we tend to sell them at zine fairs at pay what you want, which means people can afford it even if they only have $1 to spend. And there's usually food recipes, and there's some articles about somebody that we respect and love, or there's like a music playlist or poetries or some games to do through, like, just in the same way, like crossword puzzles and so on. So this was the very first Affinity Journal we did. And now I'm going to show you an Affinity Journal that it just unfortunately got pushed back by what's happening right now. In fact, the title, it still says February, but this was an Affinity Journal that we were doing for Black History Month with our publishing and active team. And so, as you can see, these are how the pages are laid out, with pieces of paper glued together. This was the cover. And then I'm going to show you some of the spreads in it. It's a little bit difficult to hold it. This was the first spread with a poem. And this was an article on this collective called The Move from Philadelphia. This collected, similar to the Black Panther Party, had been working in their community for many years, and then in the 80s they were all arrested and their home base was burned down, and all of these, most of the ones that managed to survive were incarcerated for over 40 years, and they were just all released in the last few months. And so this is music spreads here. This was an article on Black farmers and coalitions of farmers. This is an article about Hattie Carton, who's a gardener in Brooklyn who brought the concept of having trees in the streets of Brooklyn. She was an amazing activist, but not very well known, unfortunately. And then this is a spread on Sun Ra, this musician, as you can see. And then there's more musical spreads. But you see how everything is very collagey. Everything is like glued together. Now these are spreads that are copied already, but you can have an idea of how they are. So these would have been our next publication, but I'm not sure when that will happen at this point. And then I'm going to show you, if there's any questions, obviously, as usual, keep going as you have been. Otherwise, I'll move to the next, which is my practice.
Oh, I had a question.
Yes, please.
It is, like, yeah, looking at these, it kind of reminds me of people's, like, Instagrams or Tumblrs. I'm wondering if you could say something about, like, what the difference is in publishing online and publishing in print would be.
Absolutely. So it's very, very interesting. What you're asking actually is something that I should have touched on when I was talking about the history. Because, so the way that I was saying earlier, how like at some point in the late 90s to early 2000, zines became more of an important thing for artists, it's actually connected to that. So the relevance of zines in the 70s and 80s and 60s, it was to do with the fact that they were trying to spread information and spread the word of things that weren't highlighted by the mainstream, so by the mainstream magazines. At that time, there wasn't obviously an internet. There were some pirate radios and there were some public access TV in the United States, but regular people weren't really able to get access to that either. And so photocopying something, putting them on print and give it around for like $1 or 50 cents for however cheaply they could, it was the same way as making a blog or making a forum and a Tumblr and sharing your work. And then once in the early 2000s, people started using platforms like Tumblr, MySpace, or Facebook, whatever was coming around that time. All of that strength, that power that zines had, that was basically disseminating information that wasn't mainstream, shifted on digital. And the reasons why that happened is because digital was free, first of all, and digital could be disseminated in much larger scale than a photocopied zine could be done by being handed hand to hand. So right now, if I was a kid in the 80s and I wanted people to know about this band that I loved, I could only really let people know in my cities, in my town, in my circle. But if I was a kid in early 2000, suddenly I could have let people know about the band that I love to the entire world for free, literally by just logging in and doing it. And so suddenly the relevance of zines being like an informative tool, an informative medium, kind of got lost. That's why it became more of like an ephemeral thing, and it became more of a piece of art, and it became more used by artists. So suddenly zine replaced the concept of a published book by an editor. So that's kind of where the difference is. While fanzines in the 70s were like basically taking the place of magazines, mainstream magazines, now zines are taking places of mainstream publications and books made by proper editor and publishers, if you know what I mean. There is also the fact that, and this is now going back to now having been several years of digital information, there's also the fact that it's true, you can post about a band on your Instagram nowadays, and we have 35,000 followers, so you might have 35,000 people know about it suddenly, maybe 3,000 people liking it. But tomorrow, majority of those people have forgotten about what you just mentioned because they've been assaulted by an amount of information that was they just like kind of over covered whatever they were learning then. And so the difference with zines is that this zine we published in 2017 is still here. Every time I look at it, the information's still there. And if I bought these zines then, I can always look back at it and be reminded by whatever information was given here. It's very difficult that somebody keeps going back 3 years later to a post on Instagram and being like, oh, I remember about that band that was mentioned during that post on that Twitter or Instagram or whatever it is. So I think that's the difference. You can reach out to way more people, much cheaper in way more places, much quicker now. But the depth to which you can reach out, it's not quite. I still find the printed material being like a little bit more effective. I guess it's still the same. The same thing goes for like art. So I can post a photograph from my Instagram today, and everybody might like it on my feed. But again, within few minutes, they forgot because there's been already another image that was more, I don't know, more effective for them, and they overcrowded mine. And then in 10 more minutes, there would be another 10 images that took their place. So they forgot. But when I make a zine, I have friends that still look at zines that I've made months ago, and they still like send me pictures of it every once in a while. Oh, I looked at these back. These were so cool. They can constantly go back. So that's now I'm going back to my practice. So I don't have my own Instagram. I don't have any social media of my own. But every full moon, every day there's a full moon, I gather all the photographs that I've taken with my cell phone, with my cameras, with whatever I take a lot of pictures, and then I print them all, and then I make a layout, a zine, and then I make a zine. So it was a full moon 2 days ago. So right now I printed out about 150 photographs. I print them at Walgreens, where you can get them very cheap. All of these were, I think, $10, $12. And I'm going to go through all of these today. As you can see, they're all Zoom meetings and things that happened this month in my life. Here's the moon. And I'm going to lay them out later on and put it together into a zine. I usually make 30 copies and give it to my friends. This is the one that I'm making today is number 69. So I've made 5 years worth of full moons. And this was 2 zines ago. You can see it's called Luna. So this is basically my Instagram. But the difference is that my Instagram comes out once a month. Only 30 people get it. And those 30 people can look back at it throughout their months and the months that follow, and on and on and on. And it's also like a way, I don't work in photography anymore, but when I was working in photography, it was a good way for me to, instead of giving a business card at a meeting, I would just leave them a zine, and they could just like, they have a little bit more of an understanding of my work, and they also have a constant reminder that I exist. So this was a laid out zine that I made just 2 months ago of things that happened to me. I went to Niagara Falls in that month, and so on.
Even working as a cartoonist and illustrator, it's very common practice now to start your career making mini comics and zines and handing them out to publishers, and then they have them as reference. It's it's really like cold calling and sending emails is really not very effective, and zines are much more direct.
I agree. And even just shipping a zine costs you $2. And it's, if you send a zine to some editor or someone that's running a magazine that you like, they suddenly receiving something that's physical of yours, and it's so much easier to like, you know. I agree,
Absolutely.
especially for illustrators. It's even more direct. You don't even need to print them, you just need to draw. Sorry.
Yes. No, and I visited my publisher a few months ago, and it's really like they archive them, they keep them for reference, and to keep in touch with the artist. So it makes me happy, you know, knowing that it still matters.
Yeah, so much. Seriously, it's the best if for anyone that wants to get into any sort of, I think, any sort of creative field, whether again you're a writer or you're an illustrator or photographer. It's really the simplest. You just need to find a good cheap printer if you don't have a printer at home. I used to, for the longest time, we used to with Able, before we bought our own printers, we used to go to pharmacies. There's many pharmacies in Brooklyn that do 5 cents photocopies, and they can print up to, this is the biggest they can print, and it's called legal size. It's a weird paper, but it comes out square, and it's something a little bit more interesting than like a regular. I'll show you what a regular one would be like. So it's a little bit larger than a regular one, and when you open it up, it has this like nice feel, almost like a book, but it costs the same money as printing on a regular one if you go into like pharmacies or Kinko's. But Kinko's is 12 cents, pharmacies 5 cents, and then we would just go and like print hundreds of copies of zines at these pharmacies. So if you find like a cheap printer that you like, just make them on paper, make the zine what we call the master, in the same way that the Affinity Journal that I showed you, make the master and then worship your master. That master will last forever. You can constantly reprint. I personally don't use much InDesign or programs just because I always end up fighting with technology of that kind. Well, that kind of technology will never get wrong. Like once you make a master and it's physical, you can always go and take it and you copy and it's done. That's what I'm going to do today after this, and that's what I do every time is a full moon, and I really enjoy doing it personally. And you can go create it. This was like zine. This was the Luna number 50 that I did, and I just use a binding. This is a very cheap binding technique, calm binding it's called. You can find the Kinko's for free. You can do it yourself. And I would just print on a regular paper and fold it. So each one of these are like made like that. You can always be creative if you just, once you learn the basics, then you can always expand, like everything. Once you're like really you're solid on your basic, you can always like grow from that. Any other questions? I feel like I talked for an hour. Okay.
That was really great. It feels like we kind of got like a little history of the LES too, like just looking at the zines coming.
Yeah, this area, it's since very long time has been such a center for all community groups like ours and collectives. So it feels really great for us to be here for that reason. You're really giving highlights to something that always needed, always was here, and LELE had gone a little bit older. It's important to bring back that sort of energy, I think.
Yeah, I agree. You have to actively keep it alive.
Very much. So I just suggest make a zine. This is like the perfect time to make a zine, to make masters. Even if you don't have a printer, you can't go print. Make as many masters as you can, and then just go and print as soon as you get access to a copier. Or if you have a printer at home, make them at home. It's really the best way of like entertain yourself and also experiment, and without feeling too much you're risking too much, basically.
Mm-hmm. We're having what we're trying to implement online is having the kids make at least one comic page a week, and I'd like to at the end have them send them to me or something so I can print them into little zines for them. I think it'd be nice, a weird souvenir of this time.
Yeah, exactly. And if you want, we'll keep them in the library. If you want to send us a copy, that would be nice.
I think that I would love that, and I think they would like that too. I can make them into one big anthology.
Yeah, and maybe I mean, definitely once all of this is over, we just look forward to have you all here if ever happens.
Yeah, that would be amazing. Oh, that was my other question is like, you know, I see like behind you, it looks like it's kind of a zine library. And then, you know, after the quarantine, could kids come and look through the zines? Is it available?
Absolutely. Yes, it's already, I mean, not right now, but before this was happening, it was already open Thursday to the public, Thursday through Sunday, 12 to 6. But by appointments, we could do it almost every day. It all depends on when any of our volunteers is available to open. But Thursday through Sunday is always open. And we can schedule in the way that we're going to do this one now. We can schedule a whole tour. You can come and flip through zines. And we have a copier here. So whenever people come and look at zines, they can also copy pages of spreads that they want to take home. And yeah, absolutely. This is available for anyone.
Wow.
Oh, fantastic. We should do a whole zine tour. We could go to Blue Stockings and then 8 Ball. Go not to Printed Matter, it's too far away, but the whole Lower East Side tour. I think that would be
there's a little Printed Matter open actually a little store on St. Mark's, I think. St. Mark's and First at the Swiss Institute. So you could be going there. And there's no any other places beside those places actually. But
yeah, it's Blue Stockings is one of the only it was one of the only ones I knew before you. So I'm glad there are 2 and not just 1.
Yeah, definitely. There's this one collective community space called ABC No Rio that existed since the 80s, but they have a big zine library, but they have also been closed for 3 years because they restructuring their building. There was some building issues. So once they reopen, that's a good place to go to.
Oh, I'll make note of that.
There's Windy Subway, but it's in Brooklyn too.
Yeah, Quimby's.
Yeah, and a lot of
yes.
Here, I'm writing all these down. There are a lot of comic stores.
Yeah, exactly. Next to Quimby's, there's also that comic book store. What was it called? Desert Island.
Desert Island.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're actually wonderful, but it's a for-profit thing.
Yeah, it's different the way that it works. Okay, so if there's no more questions, should we end?
So. Yeah, thank you so much for showing us that. It was
of
really
course.
Cool.
It was a real pleasure. I'm glad that I got